Welcome back to season 2 of the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and I am so grateful that you're joining us. When I started this podcast last year, my primary goal was to normalize the experience of imposter syndrome, to make it easier for us to talk about, and to access the support that we deserve. I am so grateful to everyone who has shared their stories with me, and I'm fascinated by the linkages between imposter syndrome and so many other facets of our lives. The conversations that we had last season led us in so many powerful directions. I'm excited to continue these conversations in season 2. As always, if you have a story to share, please reach out to me. I would love to interview you. And if I can ever support you on your own imposter syndrome journey, I'd love to connect on that too. Thanks again for being here. Welcome, Margot. I'm really excited for us to have this conversation today. Would love to start by getting to know you a little bit. What can you tell us about yourself?
Hi, Kim. First of all, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited. I am an empowerment and relationship coach. One of my primary focuses is to support women who are stuck in stagnant relationships, or they think, hey, I'd like my relationship to be a bit better. And so basically I support them in helping unravel unhealthy patterns, helping them tap into their inner power and really create shifts in their relationships. I have a really strong background in psychotherapy. I'm a certified hypnotherapist, coach. I've studied a lot of different modalities through the years. I basically bring them together to help women be more empowered in their lives and relationships. So I'm really excited that the thing I'm doing this month is Relationship Reset Bootcamp. So helping a whole bunch of women together really get empowered in their relationships. So I'm excited about that.
That's great. Yeah. And we can share more information about that in the show notes too. I'd love to ask you a couple of questions that I typically ask, which is, what does imposter syndrome mean to you? And how, if at all, has it shown up in your life?
Yeah, imposter syndrome for me means that I'm pretending to be somebody I'm not, or afraid that I'm going to be found out, that all of a sudden somebody's going to say, what? You've been pretending this whole time? Who do you think you are? And it's kind of like living with this nagging fear of being found out. So this is something I've experienced, I would think, most of my life. Even as a teenager, I was always referred to as, the smart one, the one that knows everything. And I kept thinking, I don't really know anything. Who are these people talking about? And so even when I was receiving these compliments, I couldn't really take them in. I kept thinking, they don't know what they're talking about. For some reason, they think I'm smart. They think I have my act together, but I really don't. And what if they discover that? So fast forward, when I graduated from school, I had this dream to go work in France. And eventually I was hired by Procter & Gamble in Paris. And so I had this very prestigious job. And that's when the imposter syndrome really struck the hardest in my life, because I had this job where everybody was like, oh, wow, you're working as a brand manager of Procter & Gamble in Paris. And I felt like all this pressure of performing, of showing up a certain way happened. And I would feel almost sick walking into work because I was afraid that they were going to discover that I really wasn't as smart as they thought I was.
Wow. And it's so classic what you're describing too, right? It's like, well, they don't really know the truth, right? If they knew the real truth about what I know or don't know, they would never say these things to me, or they would never have these expectations, right? How did you manage that? I mean, it must have been stressful while you were in that role to be feeling that way. Were you at the time consciously aware that you were doing that? Did you have specific things that you used to manage it?
Yeah. So basically what happened back then was that I was pretty much a wreck for, I would say, a couple of years. Honestly, I was walking around and really working hard. The first way I tried to manage it was to show up even more. It was like, okay, I better really dedicate myself and work late so they can't find out, how I'm not good enough. I better study extra hard and be the best student ever. I think one of my strategies has been like to be the best student, to really show up and go for it. And I was really unhappy. And so my mother actually came along and said, hey, I think you might have a worthiness issue, because I kept telling her, I'm going to be found out. My boss doesn't think I'm working hard enough. And I was creating all this stuff in my mind about how I needed to perform better. So that was kind of the beginning of an inner journey where I uncovered that I had parts of myself that were very insecure, and that they would show up to try to, I would say, almost protect me, like, oh, don't go too far out there, don't go any further, because you're going to be found out, you're going to be rejected. And so that these parts started to show up, and I became aware of those through doing some hypnotherapy work, actually, and that during that time.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting way to access that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's something that I don't know a whole lot about.
Well, so basically what we did was kind of just go back, you kind of regress back in time as a hypnotherapist, I would say, to those memories when you first felt this sort of inadequacy. For me, it always showed up as not being good enough. Those were the words that I would say that were kind of the root of the imposter syndrome, right? If I'm not good enough, everybody else is going to find out. And what's interesting for me is it would take me back in time to situations when I was young, where for whatever reason, I got this message, or I took this message on from the outer world. So the point in that, though, is at that time when you're young and you make a mistake. For instance, a situation where I wasn't watching my brother and he lit the garage on fire. In that moment, you may take it on. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm the worst person. The garage is on fire, and you have all these emotions, right, that are in your body. And then they actually create this belief. A belief starts forming, like, oh, I don't have my act together. Oh my gosh, the house almost burned down, right? So what happens in the hypnotherapy world is that you're able to release all those emotions by expressing them and having these conversations in the past that allow you to let go of it. And then you do this thing called, basically rewriting the story. You're able to see a new storyline, because your imagination is actually more powerful than the reality. If you can actually just see a whole new storyline where you're more empowered in the situation, you start feeling more empowered. You're able to start reprogramming yourself that way. I'm trying to simplify this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's really interesting. And, I never thought about it from a hypnotherapy perspective before, but I do see the value. I often talked about the value of looking back at those origin stories, or, just how we experienced messages or moments through a much less mature brain, right? And the opportunity to reframe it through a different mindset.
And it's amazing how just reframing a few of them really created a big shift for me. So basically what happened is I went into this big hypnotherapy intensive. At the beginning, I was really feeling low, less than, and not able to handle my work at Procter & Gamble. I was really like, I think I'm going to be found at any moment. I had started feeling sick, and like sick to my stomach when I was showing up at work. And then by doing an intensive, basically, I did like 5 of these sessions in a row. And then I did this work on reprogramming more self-acceptance and self-love into my body by doing all these self-love exercises. So basically, quickly, for like 3 months, every single day when I walked to work and when I came back, I would just say, I love you, Margot. I love this about you. I love that about you. I was doing really proactive, like, programming, and really focused on what I loved about myself to try to get out of this feeling of not being good enough and something being wrong with me. And it worked to some degree. I'm not saying that it was 100%, but definitely there was a shift to the level where my boss actually came to me and said, I don't know what happened to you, but you're so much more confident. And they ended up promoting me after I thought they were about to fire me like any moment. That's how I
Wow. So I'm imagining then that really did influence your whole experience at work.
Yeah, my whole experience got like, wow. First of all, a lot of this came from me. This was not the reality. I think one of the things that's been helpful for me and that I work with my clients on is the fact that we create all these stories about ourselves and and we attach meaning to things that happen in our worlds. And this may not be true. Our mind is creating fiction almost. And so for me, it was really helpful to uncover the fact that I had created a story about not being good enough, about being this imposter that was about to be fired. And that really hadn't been the reality. The other people had seen me through different lenses and seen more what my strengths were. So that enabled me to actually start moving out in the world further and further into what I really wanted to do and to more my life purpose. So it was very pivotal for me. Of course, this imposter syndrome did keep showing up in different ways, but it feels like sort of the core part of it that was so strong was dismantled to some degree. Like I was able to move forward and take those steps outside of my comfort zone even further. So eventually when I quit that job, taking that big step and saying, I'm quitting this amazing prestigious job to go after my dreams, that was one more time when I stepped out of my comfort zone. And I think that's when the imposter syndrome can get strong. And then if you know that and you're conscious, like if I move out of my comfort zone, imposter syndrome could show up, then you're able to be more empowered in that moment and say, okay, let's watch out for this and let's see what I need to do to have the strengths to move out of this comfort zone. That is basically, it's encased. We allow it to encase us because we're so afraid, at least I believe we're so afraid of what lies in the unknown, right? Like what's going to happen? Am I going to be rejected? Am I going to fail? All these fear of failure things start showing up. So anyway, that's when I think we need to really watch out for it, is when we're in this transition, when we're doing something new and that's uncomfortable for us.
That's exactly right. I think that's one of the benefits of having these kinds of conversations and recognizing what imposter syndrome looks like, because it does allow us to anticipate it and to give it the appropriate level of respect, I guess, is a way of thinking about it, right? Because I do see it as a security measure, right? It is in many ways designed to keep us safe from harm. And if we respect what it's trying to do, we can manage it more effectively, not give in to the story that it's trying to tell us, like you said, right? It's trying to get our attention here for a reason, and to instead give it the support that it is looking for and find a path forward that is accepting of that.
Yeah, I like how you say that, because I really believe that all parts of you, and I say the word parts, I believe that we have a lot of different kind of energetic parts, right? That they all have your best interest. They all really care about a good outcome. Some of them may now look positive. Hey, it's stopping me. It's saying I'm not good enough. It's maybe sabotaging, like this could also sabotage some of your best laid plans and maybe lead to procrastination, for instance. But I do believe, like you said, that every part really cares about our future, really wants us to be successful. And that it's really about working with those parts and being clear. Something I've done a lot with my clients, having my hypnotherapeutic background too, where is just to be able to access that part and be like, oh, okay, what do you really need to feel safe? What do you really need to take this next step? And so I think it's about making sure we have that need met, and whatever that need is, whether it's safety, whether it's being willing to make a mistake, that reassurance that happens. So for me, what I kind of do in my everyday life is I listen to what I call those gremlin voices. I become aware that there's a voice saying, hey, that's a bad idea. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Are you crazy? No, and I hear those voices. Now I'm able to say, oh, that's a little gremlin voice, or hey, that's that little child who's scared. I'm able to figure out what part of me is saying that voice. So what's great about it is it doesn't have full power over me when I'm able to separate it out and say, oh, that's a part of me who has that fear, who has this need. How can I solve that? How can I support this part of me in moving forward?
I love that. And I'm curious because you do relationship coaching, right? I talk a lot about imposter syndrome in the context of work. Do you see this in relationships as well?
Yeah, well, one of the places I think is this whole thing about wanting to show up as, especially the beginning of a relationship, as like, well, I'm like the ultimate wife, I'm the ultimate husband, right? And there's this role, and also mother, father, for instance, there's this role that we want to play. And I really saw that in my relationship when I was married. This is when I saw it in my relationship context in my own world, is wanting to show up in a way almost that was like, I'm the perfect person, I'm the perfect spouse, I'm the perfect wife, so that you'll love me and will never leave me. Like, so what if they found out that I really wasn't that great of a person? How come they really love me? So this goes to this whole thing about maybe not feeling 100% lovable, which I'm sure we all work with. My clients for sure work with, is that if you don't feel 100% lovable, then you're thinking also, I'm kind of an imposter here. I'm showing up in this relationship, but one day you're going to discover there's something really wrong with me. And you're going to be like, hey, I can't be married to you anymore. This is crazy. You have this problem. You have this flaw. And so even in my relationship with my soulmate, this beautiful man, that my partner is, there are still moments when I say to him, I say, can you love me with even this? And I bring it to the table. The fact that I'm insecure about this, he's like, of course I love you. I don't even love your insecurities. And so it's such a great gift to have somebody in a relationship where you've worked enough with your partner and you've have these tools where you can ask for reassurance when you need it. So you don't have to pretend, you can just be real. And that's the whole thing that I really think is important in a relationship, is you can create a much healthier relationship if you can learn to be vulnerable. And that's like the opposite, I think, of the imposter syndrome in one way, because it's about bringing up what you're insecure about, your vulnerability to your partner, instead of trying to pretend that you have your act together.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it, because I do think that part of the power of imposter syndrome comes from not just that feeling that I'm not good enough, but the need to desperately hide that from other people, right? And so it compounds the effects of it, because we're so afraid of being found out that we can't be vulnerable. We can't be honest with anybody for that fear. And so the reality of it, as counterintuitive as it might feel to us in the moment, is that as soon as we start to say these things out loud, we start to realize often the absurdity of what we're thinking, the fiction behind the stories that we've been telling ourselves. And like you're saying, get the reassurance from the people around us that there's no basis for these fears.
Yeah. And one of the most beautiful things, I think, is that when you can show up and show your flaws, perceived flaws, that allows who's ever witnessing you, a partner, a friend, even a client, actually, the ability to connect with you, I would say heart to heart, to really recognize themselves in you, because we all have very similar fears and concerns. And so when you're able to be like, wow, this is something that's true for me, people are like, oh yeah, I've experienced that, or I can have compassion for you, I can get you. And you have this real heart to heart connection that's created. Whereas I think if we try to pretend to be somebody, or we try to show up maybe a little bit more complete than we are, then it's hard for people to really relate to us. They think, oh, they have their act together, I don't have mine together. And there's this separation that's created. So that vulnerability really creates connection. in my opinion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I also think that sense too so you're talking about the really powerful effect of the person that you're trying to have a relationship with, but also like we're talking about the internal perspective too. If you feel like I'm not being authentic, then I'm always going to worry that the only reason why the people around me are interacting with me is because of the persona that I am putting on right now, right? Not my true self.
That is such an excellent point. And that persona that we're trying so hard to keep like this, it's almost like a mask we're wearing. We're like protecting ourselves from the outer world. The big thing too that happens is that we waste a lot of time and energy on this. And it's exhausting to wear a persona, to not show up as who you are, to try to be something more than quote unquote you are. Like with my ex-husband, I was always trying to be kind of more in quote unquote enlightened. Like I didn't want to like show that I had too many issues. I didn't think he had time for my issues.
Yeah. And I think what's really hard about this too, and this is a thought that's not fully formulated in my mind right now. So I'm going to start speaking and hope that it makes sense, but is the idea that we can let go of needing everybody to like us and be okay with the fact that if it's not this partner or this boss or whoever it is, that if I'm not feeling a connection when I show up as my authentic self, that's not a defect on my part, right? But that it's, just that we're not always going to connect with everybody, and that's okay. And that's a hard thing for perfectionists, people pleaser. I count myself among those, right? It's really hard to get to a place where it feels okay to not only be vulnerable, but to have that vulnerability lead to some, disconnect or walking away from a certain relationship.
I think that is so important what you're saying there. And it's something that I have spent my lifetime really working on. Is there is this inherent desire that everybody, like us, appreciate us, that we can connect with everybody somehow. And I think that's a beautiful thing about being human. And yet, as you say, that really isn't the reality. And so I've come to this whole kind of concept in relationship that it's really about sorting instead of settling. That when I was younger, I would be like, oh, there's some connection. I'm going to settle for this, but maybe I can't really be 100% authentic, but that's okay. I can play around enough to make this thing work. There was some like, I'm going to make it work. So I was settling. But then if you're sorting, if you're like, hey, does this really match who I am? I'm going to show up completely and allow this to be more of a sorting process. Then I think as far as relationship goes, one a great example, I think that you're more apt then to have somebody who really matches you, where there is an alignment. And of course you can show up authentically and they can show up authentically because there's a match. So you don't have to be an imposter to try to somehow match this other person because you're afraid nobody else is ever going to come across you. You're never going to find your dream man or woman. You've got to try to pretend.
Exactly. And, I've told the story too, or I've conveyed that this part of myself where, I grew up moving a lot. So I never felt rooted in any place that I was. And I often felt like the new kid, or I didn't have the foundation in my relationships that a lot of other people had. So I always felt like I have to be the nice person. I have to be the likable person because there's not enough, the relationship's too fragile to withstand anything heavy. And I remember, at times when I was younger, just feeling this overwhelming pressure to conform because that's what's going to make people like me. And when I would get it wrong, right? Like I was always calculating and always feeling like, okay, here's the right response to this situation, or here's how I need to show up. And if I would get it wrong, it was devastating to me because it wasn't coming from a place of truth. It was coming from like a a calculation. I felt like I miscalculated. And I was like, oh no, if only I had done it this way. And it's exhausting to be thinking about how to orchestrate every response and every interaction that you have with people. I think it would have been easier if I had just been true to myself and it hadn't landed well, to process that than to process the fact that like, oh, I got the system wrong. Right?
Totally. I so relate to you. I think I did the exact same thing most of my childhood, at least my teenage years, always calculating like, what can I say to somehow fit into this group? And then feeling like I made a mistake because I didn't quite get the response I wanted to. And so I was playing so many games that I was exhausted by it. And also I had no sense of self. One of the things that I learned in my 20s and 30s was that my sense of self had been dependent on other people's images, opinions, what they wanted of me. And so I was going around trying to change my sense of self as I was going to try to fit in so that they wouldn't uncover or discover that something was wrong with me. I have to change myself now to fit into this group. So I was kind of confused about who I really was. When I reached about 30, I'm like, whoa, I need to find myself here.
Exactly. That it is interesting. I can only imagine how many people listening can relate to that, because it is in many ways part of just the human experience of finding ourselves and figuring out how to navigate our environments. But, I do think that pressure to fit in, right, is really, really strong at certain times in our lives. And, oh gosh, would never want to repeat those days. Is there anything else that you would recommend to people who maybe are hearing our conversation and thinking, that's me, and I don't know what to do about it?
Well, I would like to really go back to those gremlin voices. I mean, there's a few things that have been really helpful for me, and maybe just to break that down a little bit more, how to work with that, because it's something that's it comes up so often, and I think it's so fast, like 30 seconds, you can create a shift with it. So it would be really helpful, I think, for your listeners to learn how to do this. So for me, what I do is, first of all, is to gain kind of awareness about what are these voices and what are they saying most often to you. You normally have like only 2 to 3 kinds of voices that are saying it over and over, like, hey, they're going to find out you're not good enough. Why did you do this? And for me, it shows up a lot of, why did you say that? Why did you do this? So it's kind of a doubting thing. So when I hear that voice, I consciously actually say, oh, there's that gremlin. I do something to acknowledge it as outside of me, quote unquote, outside of the adult strong self. Like, oh, there's that gremlin voice. Ooh, okay. So it's kind of like a watch out. And then I sort of have this quick little inner dialogue. Okay, I hear what you're saying. I get you. You kind of recognize it. You validate it with like, I hear you. I understand you're concerned. Like you would be speaking to a small child who was kind of concerned or frightened. And then you use the word and, not to negate that. So the word and is this nice connecting word. And then you can follow kind of with the truth, quote unquote, what the adult self kind of knows, the strong self. Like, hey, I get that you're concerned about how we said that. And I was just expressing my truth. It's okay. That was our truth. Our truth is okay. So it's having these sort of quick 30-second inner dialogues that start retraining that gremlin voice that I found really helpful.
I like that a lot. Yeah. And I think it requires a certain level of conscious awareness, right, of what's going on. Once you start to do that, it becomes more automatic. If it's going to take more time in the beginning to notice, to have this kind of conversation with yourself, but eventually it becomes a natural process.
Yeah, you're exactly right about that. And what I say to my clients is that the most important thing is the awareness process at the beginning. And this is where you have to have the most patience. And so to start really paying attention to what are some of those little thoughts that come quickly and write them down to create an awareness about what are you really saying to yourself? What are these gremlin voices coming up? That actually is the first step, and to not get impatient with yourself, to be like, oh, I'm right now just in the awareness phase. I'm just noticing what I actually say to myself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think that we get very, especially those of us who are high achievers, perfectionists, right? But that observation phase is so important.
Yeah, I like the word you said, observation, because it really is observing ourselves and being able to step back and say, "Ooh, what's my inner dialogue really?" And what sparks my inner dialogue? What are those triggers? So for me, in the awareness phase, the observation phase, just being clear on what are my core triggers and what do I saying to myself, that sets a foundation where then you can start practicing this validation, and then leading with what I call the truth of the matter. What's really going on here?
Yeah. And I'm guessing that you notice that this works with your clients.
Yeah, it totally works with my clients. It works in relationships, and it works, I think, in your everyday life. And for me, I have found that we can reprogram ourselves actually by what we say to ourselves. We are not a victim to our thoughts. I think it's all about empowerment, and we're both on the page of empowerment here. It's empowering ourselves to realize we have a lot more control over what we're thinking than we think we do. We can keep focusing on what we do want to believe about ourselves. What is the truth about ourselves? I'm doing this thing that I recommend to clients. I love this, which is 5 minutes of magnificence a day, I call it. And the idea is that you focus for 5 minutes on your magnificence. I'm like, these are the things I am really magnificent at, that I'm showing up 100%, that I can really like delight in. Here's how I show up in the world in a magnificent way. And that, I think, is a really good tool also, that sort of compensates or is able to support you moving more out of the imposter syndrome place, when you can really think, these are the things that it's beautiful about me. I'm so happy to celebrate with the world.
I love that too. I think that's such a great habit to get into, because it is so easy to tune into the negative, right?
Well, and I think we're so much harder on ourselves than anybody else is. And so if we're spending our time focused on where we're not good at, then we're just going to keep looking at that versus saying, okay, what am I great at? What's my magnificence? And one other thing I wanted to bring in that I had this realization about just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, was the baseline thing, is that we have a baseline that is much higher than we realize. So basically what I'm saying is, we're going along and we don't see how magnificent we are unless we really stop, because we are shifting and growing so much. So our baseline's changed. And so in our mind, though, we're still like, I haven't gotten anywhere, but really somebody from the outer world would be, wow, you've really changed and grown. So I think as a coach, it's really helpful to show our clients how they have grown, how their baseline's changed. Because it's hard to know that inside yourself. You still think like, oh, I should be better. I should be a better public speaker. I should be a better friend. I should be better at relationships. But then you're able to point out somebody else like, wow, you've actually, this much growth happened here. You're so much different than you were 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 months ago. And so I think that ability to see our new baseline and recognize that there has been a change is important. And that's what I'm also really working with myself and my clients on, remembering like, oh, your baseline's changed.
I love that. That's such a great point. Yeah, because we don't see it. We don't notice. Yeah. I could talk to you all day, Margot. This conversation is so wonderful. I love what we're talking about. As we're wrapping up, what motivated you to want to tell your story today?
Well, I really want people to feel empowered in their lives. I think that it's so important for us to recognize that it's normal to have thoughts, imposter thoughts, to have I'm not good enough thoughts, and this is part of being human. And so I want people to know that it's normal. And so I'm really happy you're doing this podcast, because it's bringing it out of the hidden world and making it sound like, and know that it is the truth that almost everybody suffers from very similar feelings and belief systems. And so if we know that, then we don't have to stay small anymore. We can be like courageous enough. I want to help women feel more courageous to go out there and really do. I say women because I'm focused more on women right now, but women and men feel courageous to go out there and do what their heart really is calling them to do. And so that often requires moving through that imposter syndrome phase.
I love it. Yeah. Thank you for what you do. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again for listening today. If you're struggling with imposter syndrome and you'd like additional support, check out the show notes for more resources or contact me directly. I would love to help you. And if you'd like to tell your story, I would love to interview you. You will find my contact info in the show notes, so reach out anytime. Thanks again.